You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Jake Meyer of California State University, Long Beach. Jake, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Great, thank you for having me on. It's pronounced Meyer though. But
Meyer, okay. So Jake's work concerns financial and banking crises, and it specifically looks at the relationship between financial crises and politics or, public choice. So it looks at financial crises and democracy and the specific elements of democratic systems like interest group politics. We'll get into all of that in the course of our conversation. But first, Jake, how about you start by just giving a little background? I think we all know sort of roughly what a banking crisis is, or we can recognize when all the newspapers are panicking about banks and financial institutions that is a crisis. But how in your research do you define and recognize a banking crisis?
Well, so there's two main ways, or there's two main kind of families of ways in which researchers will define an event as a banking crisis. So the first of these is looking at the status of the banks in terms of whether they failed or whether they're failing, and policy events such as whether or not governments or central banks have come in to recapitalize banks and have engaged in these large policy moves to protect the banks. So one of these is related to the actual action of policymakers in the banks themselves. The other is related to measures of stress. And these are a little more nuanced. So the measures of stress are based on looking at reports of the banks to regulatory agencies, or looking at reports of the banks to international investors and such, and then doing a sort of text-based analysis to see how much of the language is showing up as indicating stress. And those will usually be tallied as a number between 0 and 1. So it's an index. And then they'll call it a crisis when it crosses some threshold of this index. The first one, that's based on the policy response in the failing banks, is a 0-1. And that will be a qualitative assessment of whether the person who's coding it, which is two people who work at the IMS, then in Valencia, whether they have decided that it meets their conditions for a crisis.
So I think everybody thinks about the 2008 crisis when they hear about this. Would you say your research a lot of it is focused on 2008, or do you have a larger sample of crises you look at beyond the one global crisis that we all know about and think about?
Well, so I'm much more interested in actually understanding the kind of concept of itself and understanding what generates crises, more so than a look at a single crisis itself. So while 08 is a very large portion of my sample that I'm analyzing, because it involved a lot of crises in a lot of countries, we also have other very large events that are in there. The most prominent one that comes to mind is the East Asian crisis, which is also another type of crisis that we refer to as a currency crisis, which involves a large amount of pressure on the country's exchange rate. So while there's been quite a bit of analysis done on 2008, and while I'm very familiar with it, in terms of the research that I do, it's more about explaining why crises happen and looking at this single event.
Right. So there's a saying in military affairs that generals are always fighting the last war. We don't want to get too focused on the last crisis. So, if when there's another crisis, if we have research like yours that's more general, we'll have more of a framework to look at it. If it's very different from 2008, if it doesn't happen through exactly the same channels.
Yes, and that's I love that quote. Actually, I'm not familiar with it, but I love that saying. I think that's incredibly useful idiom to have in this context.
So your work, as I mentioned in the introduction, it focuses on the relationship between these financial and banking crises and political factors. I think a lot of people sort of think intuitively that banking, well, there's a tendency to sort of separate the political from the economic and think about crises as maybe something intrinsic to capitalism. I know a lot of people during the Great Depression sort of thought that way, but these things are more related than that sort of artificial distinction would suggest. Maybe economists and political scientists are in different departments, but really we're all studying different parts of the same thing. So where did your interest in this start? Where did you first look at this intersection between politics and banking crises?
Well, so I've always been interested. Well, I shouldn't say always, but when I came to start my undergrad, I was very interested in financial crises because I started my freshman year immediately after the crisis of 2008. It was fall of 2009 is when I started. So it was something that was very fresh in my mind as I'm picking my major. And as I went through this, this course of studying economics from a freshman undergrad to finishing my PhD, it was something that just evolved from, man, I really want to know what's going on here, to this is something I want to spend my life studying. And the role of politics kind of came into this because I've always been someone who's been very interested in politics. And of course, when I was younger, it was more curiosity, and then it got into really want to understand the nuts and bolts of it. So when I was picking programs to study, I was looking for places that I could analyze the functioning of the international monetary and financial system and do it in a way that paid heavy attention to politics, that understood the role of the political systems in this whole international economic system. Because there's this tendency, especially in certain fields of macro and especially in even certain areas of international economics, to take politics as what we would call exogenous, take it as given. And I think it's a big mistake to take these political factors and then treat them as something that's just happening and that we should ignore or that we can just build into our analysis. Instead of looking at this as politics is driving economics through policy and such, economics is driving politics through people's living standards and the environment that they're living in, and understanding them as two sides of the same coin is the appropriate way to understand the actual system level behavior that we care about, that we actually care about analyzing.
Yeah, that really strikes a chord with me. I also started studying economics right in the fall of 2008. So there's never been a time when I was studying economics when people weren't talking about the financial crisis, and it does make you want to think about it and understand it more. It's such a big, complex thing, and there's been a lot of attention paid to it, but still, not enough. We haven't come to anything like a consensus view, like this is what happened and these were all the relevant factors. So moving on to your specific research, you have one paper called "Does Interest Group Strength Impact Crisis Outcomes?" So that's kind of a link between, these big macro level things like financial crises and these, really sort of micro level public choice things, these interest groups. How do you connect those two? And what kind of interest groups are we talking about here?
Yeah, so this is actually, in terms of the behavior that we're looking at, this is actually my favorite of the ones that I'm working on right now. I began with a former student about 6 months ago, and the idea grew out of the papers in my dissertation, one of which is focusing on banking crises, and another of which is focusing on these currency crises, where we have this large, sharp weakening of the currency. And what I kept finding when I was analyzing these two types of crises was that the same factors kept popping up in terms of what's causing each. You have credit growth showing up as a cause of each. You have these weak external buffers, these weak reserve ratios showing up as a determinant of each. Growth showing up as a determinant, or poor growth showing up as a determinant of both. So it struck me as something that needed a look at. Why does sometimes this outsized credit growth cause a banking crisis, and other times it causes a quick outflow that causes an exchange rate crisis? So my thought was the country's political system is going to be very, very important in an adjustment to any sort of weakness. So if you have poor economic growth, or you have this outsized credit growth that's creating a bubble, or you have high inflation, governments are, or perhaps a better one would be, you have a overvalued exchange rate. Governments are going to be able to choose between engaging in behavior that could protect a stressed banking system or engage in behavior that's going to protect a currency, keep the currency from weakening, keep it from crashing. And the way that I looked at this was, all right, the government, when we're seeing stress, can either protect the exchange rate, which would involve doing things such as tightening monetary policy, decumulating or selling off foreign exchange reserves, or these other ways, cutting budgets that will prevent this currency from weakening. But each of those factors that can protect their currency from weakening is going to put stress on the banking system. Tightening monetary policy to protect the exchange rate is going to create a liquidity problem in the financial sector. It's going to increase their cost of servicing liabilities. Cutting spending is going to be recessionary, which is going to potentially create a non-performing loan problem, or is going to make it tough for people that they've loaned out money to service their loans. So we have these factors that governments can respond with, where they can either stimulate the economy to protect the banking sector, right, loose monetary policy, increase spending to stimulate the economy, or they can contract the economy to protect the exchange rate, tight monetary policy, cutting spending, these sorts of things. And what the government is going to do, we thought when we looked at this, is they're going to make that decision based on which of these two types of events, a monetary tightening versus a monetary loosening, is going to have an outsized impact, or which of these two events will have an outsized negative impact on favored interest groups. In favored interest groups here, we're talking demographic. We're talking service sector or agricultural and manufacturing sector. We're talking high income versus low income. Financial sector versus more blue collar. And the idea here is that we have these different sorts of groups that are going to have a different sensitivity to these these tightenings, these contractions to protect the exchange rate, and these expansions to protect the financial sector. So if you're looking at these different sectors, the big ones that we found were tradables versus non-tradables. So anyone in a tradable sector, so manufacturing, agriculture, and such, is going to be helped by a weakening of their exchange rate because it will make their exports more competitive. So they're going to be helped by this weakening of the exchange rate, even though they're still going to incur a cost because goods will see their prices increase. Imports will have their prices increase. The service sector, the non-tradable sector, however, is going to see an actual weakening of their income or a reduction in their income due to this weakened exchange rate, but it's not going to help them in any way by increasing sales or anything of this nature. So we have this tradable sector that's going to be helped some and hurt some by a weak exchange rate, and the service sector that's going to just be hurt. So if this tradable sector is very strong, they're not going to mind a weaker exchange rate. So you're going to expect the government to engage in this expansionary policy, which will potentially let this exchange rate weaken quite a bit, but can protect the financial sector. And if you have, on the other hand, this non-tradable sector that's going to be deeply hurt by this weakening exchange rate, you're going to have more pressure for the government to engage in the contractionary policy that keeps that actually from occurring. And then so that was, and there was other dimensions to this, but that's the core of what we were looking at. Which policy, contractionary or expansionary, right, is going to hurt these groups more because of what it will do to the exchange rate in terms of keeping it strong or allowing it to weaken, or because of what it will do to the economy, where it either is expansionary and reduces unemployment, or it's contractionary and then protects the exchange rate.
Okay, so
sorry, I rambled on there. Yeah.
No, it's totally fine. In general, though, so if you're a general person, man on the street, you're not particularly tied to any particular industry. Maybe you're retired and you just want what's best for the country, or you're, the fictional social planner from economics models. Mm-hmm. In a crisis, you would want the interest groups to prevail who are willing who put up with more expansionary policy. Is that correct?
Well, so the thing is, overall, there's relative costs, right? Because if you protect the financial sector, if you stimulate the economy to prevent unemployment, if you do these sorts of things when you're facing some sort of shock or you're facing some sort of external pressure, you can reduce unemployment, but you're risking these large, sharp depreciations of the exchange rate, this weakening of the exchange rate, and that can be very costly as well. However, if you're on the flip side of this and you engage in a contractionary policy that protects the exchange rate, if that causes a financial crisis, if that causes a contraction that increases unemployment, that's going to be very costly as well. And when you actually look at the data, when you look at the costs of these exchange rate crises, these currency crises, and you compare it to the costs of these banking crises, there's a lot of overlap, but you do see that the financial crises tend to be a bit bigger in terms of the actual losses. So in kind of a fictional world, knowing nothing else about the situation, I would say you're probably slightly better off engaging in the expansionary policy to protect the banking sector. However, there's always confounding factors, not the least of which is that the expansionary policy likely would have in some way contributed to the buildup of the imbalances that created the banking crisis.
Right.
So
right.
It could be kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, there's no just generally good policy. Maybe if you could add up all the different utilities or outcomes, but there's no policy that's not going to hurt someone.
Correct.
There's no pure Pareto improving ideal policy out there.
Right, and that's the takeaway from this is that we're not analyzing this in a way that says, hey, this is the better way to do this. We should have a contractionary policy to protect the exchange rate. Let unemployment rise. Let some banks fail. Right? It's not saying that. It's not saying that our economy is stressed. We should have expansionary policy to keep unemployment relatively low, but then risk a large weakening of our exchange rate. It's not that one's better than the other. It's that the government's going to respond in a way that makes one of the two relatively more likely based on an analysis of which groups are going to be hurt more by it. This is not something that we're treating as explicit, that the governments are making those decisions, up front, and that's why they're doing it. We're looking at this in a way in which different sorts of political norms, things like central bank preferences, things like prior policies to perhaps maintain exchange rates at certain levels, were done in the context of this system in which the political system is aware that this tradable sector, this manufacturing, is very, very important and very, very sensitive. So if we have this situation where we have a shock, we know that we have to protect the manufacturing sector because they're the large block of votes. They're the important interest group. So because they're less sensitive to the weakening exchange rate, we stimulate the economy, keep unemployment low because low-income people are going to be very sensitive to unemployment. And that potentially leads to a situation in which the probability of a currency crisis rises relative to the probability of a banking crisis. And it's operating through these subtle mechanisms, such as exchange rates regimes, or the strength or the amount of defense or lack thereof that the countries undergo facing exchange rate pressure.
Okay. So a lot of people blame the financial crisis on too big to fail, which you could see in your framework as the financial sector is having a lot of veto power or influence over politics. Your empirical model shows that the more important sectors are agricultural and the service sector. Those particular interest groups seem to have, when they have a lot of power, seems to contribute to the prevalence of banking crises. It's a little surprising because, of course, you mentioned the difference between tradables and non-tradables. Agricultural goods are generally tradable and services are generally not. So why those two, do you think? Why those two particular interest groups? Why do they come up in the data?
Well, so the way that we were looking at this was we had two different dimensions. We had the sensitivity to the exchange rate, to the weakening exchange rate, and we had the sensitivity to the internal contractions. Or the way we thought about it was external contractions, a weakening exchange rate, or internal contractions, whether it's monetary or fiscal. And the agricultural sector is going to be, and in the interest groups that are going to be important in explaining the relative probability of crises. So we're not talking about the probability of a crisis. We're talking about if a crisis happens, is it more likely to be currency or is it more likely to be banking? So this agricultural sector is going to be very sensitive to these internal contractions. The agricultural sector in most of our sample, right, and most of our sample is relatively low income, so they're going to end up being very sensitive to unemployment and factors like this. And then we have the service sector, but they're not going to be particularly sensitive to the weakening exchange rate, because if the exchange rate weakens, then their exports are more competitive. And for most of the world, their exports are going to be priced in other currencies, typically the US dollar. So they're actually going to be receiving more of their own currency every time they sell something. So the agricultural sector is not going to mind a weakening exchange rate, but they're going to be very sensitive to a monetary or fiscal contraction. So a country is undergoing stress with a large agricultural sector. The government's going to be more likely to stimulate the economy. And if the exchange rate falls, so be it. And then that's going to be generating this sort of currency crisis, right? It's going to be increasing that probability, because the exchange rate falling, as long as it's large, is just a currency crisis. For the service sector, you have the exact opposite. So they're not going to be too sensitive to these internal contractions, because it's often tending to be high income. Globally speaking, the service sector is. The service sector is relatively high income. High income parts of the economy tend to be less sensitive to unemployment when there's a contraction. They also tend to be savers rather than borrowers. So any sort of increase in the interest rate can increase, the interest they're earning and such. So they're going to be not too opposed to an internal contraction, but a weakening exchange rate will substantially reduce their buying power. But it's not going to stimulate their sector of the economy, because they're not exporters overall. So when there's some sort of shock, there's some sort of weakness, and a government has to respond, and the rules of their political system are structured in a way that makes them more sensitive to the service sector, they're going to respond to that shock with perhaps a monetary tightening, right, to protect the exchange rate in most of these countries. And that monetary contraction, whether it's monetary, which is going to increase interest rates, or whether it's fiscal, which is going to be recessionary and can make it tougher for people that the banks have loaned money to pay back their loans, that can increase the probability of a banking crisis, but it'll protect the country from a currency crisis. And that's what we found when we did the empirical analysis on this.
Okay, so you have this trade-off when you have your own independent monetary policy. Mm-hmm. You have this trade-off between domestic, management of unemployment and things like that, and then the foreign management of the exchange rate and the value of your currency in general on foreign exchange markets. So what your paper is basically showing is that these two groups with really opposite goals, the agricultural sector and the service sector, they have a very narrow focus on one side of the trade-off. The agricultural sector would always rather focus on the exchange rate, and the service sector would always rather focus on domestic issues of monetary and fiscal policy and ignore the exchange rate. And
it's actually flipped a bit. So it's that the service sector doesn't mind the internal contractions, relatively speaking. It's the weakening exchange rate that's relatively more costly for them. The agricultural sector, the internal weakening is costly, so they don't mind the weakening exchange rate. So when the agricultural sector is relatively strong and there's a shock, you don't have that internal contraction, right? Because that's costly, and then that leads to a higher probability of the currency crisis. And in the service sector, because they're sensitive to the exchange rate, but they are less sensitive to the internal contraction, when there's a shock, right? When there's stress, the government is likely to react with this internal contraction, which protects the exchange rate, but increases the risk of a banking crisis.
Okay, but the point is that each of these sectors is very focused on one side of the trade-off and doesn't care about the other. And so if either of them is very powerful, and presumably the other one is not, then you're going to have an incentive to have a really unbalanced policy. You're not going to sort of walk the narrow path between banking crises and currency crises. You're going to go all the way to one side and have one crisis or the other.
Yep, and that's exactly what we found. And I know we started off this question talking about the U.S. in '08, and unfortunately, the U.S. is a really bad example to use for this trade-off. But yeah, that's exactly what we found when we did the quantitative work, and then when we did the theory, when we kind of laid out these preferences, we found out that it seemed to us that the manufacturing sector was not going to have a strong preference for either, or I should say, they would have either a strong preference for both or a relatively weak preference for either, depending on what component of the manufacturing sector that they were in. And that's actually what we found when we did the quantitative analysis for the manufacturing sector, which is that it had no effect on the relative probability of each type of crisis. And so so the quantitative work actually ended up backing up our kind of initial analysis surprisingly well.
Okay, so that kind of squares with my understanding of international supply chains. A lot of manufacturing, you're making tradable goods, you're selling them on a global market, but you also take tradable inputs like maybe steel and oil and stuff, and buy them on an international market. So you in terms of exchange rate, you don't benefit a lot from having a really strong or a really weak exchange rate because you're both an importer and an exporter.
Yep, that's exactly what I was referring to. And then on the income side, you have the whole issue of you have workers, if you're talking about relatively low income manufacturing, are going to be part of that, very sensitive to the contraction side. But other parts of manufacturing, don't really fit that bill and might behave more as service sectors, as the service sector does, right? In terms of their responsiveness to the internal contractions. So they were really just kind of on the fence. And then our quantitative work showed us, our estimation was that there was almost literally zero effect on the relative crisis probability of the size of the manufacturing sector.
So one thread that weaves through multiple papers you've done is veto player theory. So could you give an overview of what is a veto player and what is veto player theory?
Sure. Yeah. So veto player theory is really just academic jargon for checks and balances. That's really all it is. So the actual measurements of it get relatively complex, but what you're looking at with veto player theory is how constrained a political system is in order to change policy. So if you're looking at a parliamentary system and you have one party in charge, they're running the show, they have the prime minister, anything they want to pass, they can do very, very quickly. And if we have a situation like the US, where we have, let's say, Democrats in the House, Republicans in the Senate, and just a maverick president, and then a Supreme Court that's doing their own thing. Anything that comes up to debate in Congress is going to face a lot of hurdles to actually get implemented as policy. So in this situation, the U.S. would be said to have a lot of veto player theory, or a lot of veto players, or be high in veto players. In my example of the former system, is going to have a very low level of veto players, or have very few.
So your paper says that having more veto players magnifies the effect we've been talking about of interest groups on banking and currency crises. That runs counter to my intuition. It would seem to me that having more people with a veto means that it's more difficult, more costly for any one interest group to take over and have an inordinate effect on policy. Because if you're in a country with only one veto player, that you just need to convince that, or you need to just capture that one office. Maybe it's a prime minister, maybe it's a dictator somewhere, and then you've got total control over the society. So usually, you hear a lot of arguments in political science for division of power, which is essentially saying more veto players as a way to stabilize politics, as a way to make it, less volatile. So how come more veto players increase the effect of interest groups on crises?
Well, so it actually goes back to some work relatively early, and when people were starting to kind of just start calling this study of checks and balances veto player theory, the mid 90s or so. And there's a couple primary models out there, and this relates to two of them. So the one that you're thinking of, which is the one that's kind of more straightforward, that's very, very clear, at a glance as a way that this can operate, is that as we have a less constrained government and we have a powerful interest, it's going to be very easy for that powerful interest to exert their influence. Now, the more subtle one looked at the idea of essentially spreading blame and taking credit, in essence. So if you have many, many veto players, and any veto player here or any kind of roadblock, any actor that's a roadblock here in terms of passing legislation, if they're able to tilt something toward their preferred interests or toward their preferred interest policy preference, then they're going to be able to receive all of the benefit that comes with essentially being able to divert policy towards their favored interest preference. But they're going to receive a very, very distributed portion of the costs, because the costs are going to be spread out over every single person who's in government, because it's very tough a lot of times for political systems to pin down blame, right? So what that does here is make it so that this cost of capturing a veto player, or this cost of actually engaging in rent-seeking behavior, goes down as there's more veto players. So it's more about this idea of if we have one veto player, we just have one party in power, they're going to get all the blame and all the credit for anything that happens. If we have these five that are sharing power, and then one of them is able to kind of be the block here, or be the one who kind of these veto players are exerting their pressure through, they're going to receive all the credit, or all the interest are kind of pushing the preferences through. They're going to receive all the benefit from this, whether it's graft or whether it's kind of tilting policy just in directions that are beneficial to the interest group. They're going to receive all the credit for it, but they're going to receive a very small portion of the cost. So it's the actual veto players themselves, or the political actors themselves, that have this concentrated cost or concentrated benefits, distributed cost mechanism when they engage in basic rent-seeking behavior in a very divided system. And there's definitely been empirical analysis that supports kind of both sides of that, and it's been really interesting kind of breaking down what sorts of factors tend to behave as one of these models and what sorts of factors tend to behave as another one. And it was interesting because when we began this with my co-author, he was thinking much more in line with your initial thought, that it was going to be the lower amount of veto players that was going to be more sensitive to interest group preferences. But I had come across a couple things that were specific to interest groups where they had actually found that this model was more powerful, had more explanatory power, and that's what we ended up finding there.
Okay, so it's a tragedy of the commons where
Yes.
the costs and
Yes.
the blame are both distributed and shared, and no one person has a strong incentive to keep costs and blame for bad behavior reasonable or low.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Interesting. That's a counterintuitive result. I mean, given that it's given the way we think about politics working, maybe it's not all that obvious that it would turn out that way. But
Yeah.
I am reminded of in systems like the U.S., where you have sometimes a different party in different positions of power controlling the House and the Senate and the presidency, you do see them always blaming the other one. As long as they don't have total power, they can always point the finger at someone else in the other party.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly the mechanism here. Right. That's exactly what it is. It's making it so that it's a lot easier to kind of tilt the rules towards your favorite interest when there's this kind of divided government where you can kind of pass the blame off, and then take whatever benefit you glean from helping that specific interest.
Okay, so once the crisis occurs, you can learn from it or you can not learn from it. So another one of your papers focuses on whether countries learn, or which of course is kind of a metaphorical thing. Obviously, a country is not a person; it can't learn. But whether the institutions and the behaviors adapt in the wake of financial crises, and you look at democracy and veto players, which we've talked about, but you also look at IMF programs and central bank independence as potential roles for that affect learning in the wake of financial crises. So moving on to that paper, how do you characterize whether a society or a set of governing institutions has learned from a financial crisis? How do you quantify that?
So the way that we were measuring this was post-crisis versus pre-crisis credit growth. So for anyone out there who's familiar with quantitative work, we use what's called a diff and diff model, where we looked at the difference between a country's pre-crisis and post-crisis credit growth. And then we found the difference between that value for countries that were democratic versus countries that were autocracies or anocracies. So we're looking at credit growth, and we're looking how that post-crisis to pre-crisis credit growth changed based on whether the country is a democracy or not.
Okay, so the growth of credit then, we mentioned before, often a lot of credit growth will precede a crisis. You can have issues where you expand the supply of credit, and maybe there are bad investments that are made with that credit, and then one potential mechanism to cause a crisis is for a lot of those investments to fail all at once.
Right.
And so what you're looking at is, after there's a crisis, does the country keep expanding credit at the same rate, or does it expand it at a lower rate, maybe contract it, or maybe it doubles down on credit expansion? So you mentioned diff and diff, so I suppose you wouldn't want to be looking at a global crisis in that case, because to do diff and diff, you'd want to compare a country that had a crisis to other countries that didn't have a crisis, correct?
Right. So it was, well, so the thing is, if you have a global crisis, well, so it depends on, it'd be very tough to do it based on a global crisis in our current international system because everyone's so interlinked. Now, if you had a system where, let's say hypothetically, the kind of US, Canada, and then the Western European bloc was relatively isolated from, let's say, the East, Southeast Asian, Japan, that sort of area. If they were relatively isolated and then one of them had a crisis and the other didn't, that would be probably a great natural experiment. But the way that we had to do this, though, based on, one, data availability, well, the joke that we always make working in this field is that there just aren't enough crises. So we always have a very, very small sample to work with. So we have to work with what we have. And the way that we did this was basically by adjusting our data in a way that demeaned it by year, which let us use data points from the global financial crisis there.
Okay, so you're comparing countries that had crises to countries in not just other countries, but other countries at other times.
Yeah. Yes, and it's one of those things that we had to work with our data, a bit, and we had to do some transformations in order to avoid potential bias and other confounding factors. But yeah, that was what we actually did in the data analysis.
Okay, so sort of skipping to the punchline, you do find a big effect, a robust effect of democracy. You find that democracies, when they have a lot of the credit tends to grow significantly slower post-crisis than pre-crisis in a democracy, indicating that the institutions around lending and banking and the central bank do adapt to in the face of a crisis in democracies more so than they do in non-democracies. Why do you think that is?
Well, so I think the main mechanism is populist pressure. So if we go back to the U.S. and we use the U.S. as an example in this instance, immediately after the global financial crisis, there was a lot of pressure for financial sector reform, and we ended up having Dodd-Frank. And so in a autocracy, you would probably not get public pressure. And whether Dodd-Frank is positive or negative is beside the point for this, for this specific idea, but it almost certainly did reduce credit growth relative to what we would have seen otherwise. And so that's kind of the idea, is that if there's populist pressure, if you're able to have a political system exert that influence on the actual policymakers, you'll see that pressure that pushes for that reform.
Yeah, well, I mean, another interesting implication of this is, basically what you've shown is that democracies are likely to change policy a lot after there's a crisis. One could argue that that's going to create a lot of uncertainty. Like, on top of the uncertainty created by the crisis, you now have a political system in flux. You don't know what the rules around running a business or doing business in the country are going to be 1 year to the next. One could argue that this might make democracies more susceptible to turning financial crises into general recessions. We have seen instances where a financial crisis didn't lead to a recession, and other ones where it led to a very short recession, and other cases where you have something like the Great Recession or the Great Depression a century earlier, where things just got bad and stayed bad for a very long time. Do you have a comment on that?
I do. And that's actually where veto players come into this. And this is a great segue into that because we can use examples from actually this paper, or we can use examples from the East Asian crisis. So what's been found is that after some sort of initial crisis, some sort of pressure, some sort of shock, countries that have very, very low levels of veto players, i.e. they're able to very, very quickly shift policy, actually see this effect that you're talking about, where international markets or even domestic markets have very, very little, or have a lot of instability in the expectations for whether this is going to be, for whether policy is going to be the same tomorrow as it is today. And they pull money out, they don't invest, everyone kind of hunkers down. And then the crisis, gets worse, turns into this recession with a very large output loss. And believe it or not, you actually see the same at the other extreme of where you have these political systems that are extremely constrained. Because in that case, you've just had a crisis. You can't shift policy at all. There's nothing you can do to try to stimulate the economy. Markets don't have faith that if there is another shock somewhere, that you can shift policy and respond to it. So in that case, everyone either pulls all their money out, hunkers down. And that's where you see these very, very large output losses as well, where you see the actual effective response to the crisis, where the output losses are relatively small, is in this middle ground, this kind of Goldilocks area, right? Where you have enough constraint on the political system to where you can respond if there's another large event, but you don't have so much flexibility that investors can't develop stable expectations. And believe it or not, that's actually the third paper I sent you, the one that we haven't talked about yet. That's exactly what I found, is that on either extreme, you have this inability to generate stable expectations and very, very poor outcomes. And then in the middle, you're able to both ensure some sort of stability while still having the flexibility to respond to shocks. And then those countries tend to recover quite well from a crisis, which is what people who have looked at the East Asian crisis found. And they also tend to do better at avoiding crises, which is what I found in the third analysis.
Okay, so there's a happy medium. You don't want to be you don't want to be a dictatorship with only one veto player, and you don't want to be maybe a
12-party coalition
sort of
right.
Yeah, right. That's do you know any specific examples of countries that have a lot of veto players?
The ones that tend to have the very, very high levels of veto players are the systems where there's very large multi-party coalitions. I think some of the highest ones are Eastern Europe. Off the top of my head, I'm blanking on this, but I'm thinking one of the biggest ones in the data set might have been Romania with about 9 or 10, but I'm not positive on that. 9 or 10 parties.
I thought of a historical example. The Weimar Republic, interwar Germany, had a proportional representation system and had a lot of small and extreme parties, a very sort of fractious political system. And of course, was quite disastrous. But that's sort of, that I suppose is an example of one of these high veto player societies.
Yep. Yeah, and then there's not only that in terms of driving these responses to financial crises with respect to democracy, but the actual effect of democracy is also conditional upon how constrained it is. So even if you're looking at these, you're taking independent of the effect of these veto players on the crisis response in terms of credit growth, the effect of democracy on the later post-crisis credit growth is conditional upon the level of veto players. So what we actually found in the same analysis is that in the post-crisis period, when a democracy has very few constraints, you're in a single-party government. The credit growth falls substantially. But when you have a democracy that is very, very constrained, these sorts of places we're talking about that are just these 8-party coalitions that are very fractured, the effect of democracy on reducing credit growth is non-existent. So this effect of democracy on credit growth only operates in these relatively flexible political systems.
Okay, interesting. Your paper also discusses the role of the IMF in this learning process. How does that play into this story?
So the IMF here was interesting in that it has a bit of an either-or effect with the central bank. Or I'm sorry, I had that. Sorry, that's backwards. That was the central bank independence and then democracy. But the IMF here. So when you have these IMF standby arrangements and you have them in the presence of a very weak central bank, there's going to be very, very little in terms of the effect it has on credit growth. So if you have a country where there's not an independent central bank and the IMF comes in and says, all right, we're gonna loan you some money, we're gonna try to help fix this problem, but there's no central bank to actually implement the reforms, that this standby arrangement, this IMF program, has very little effect. But when there is a very, very strong central bank and the IMF comes in with these standby arrangements with these programs, you actually will see a very large effect of these IMF standby arrangements. So for the IMF standby arrangements to have an effect on reducing post-crisis credit growth, there has to be a relatively strong central bank. And for the central bank to have a strong effect on reducing the post-crisis credit growth, there's also some conditional factors there as well.
Okay, so I should, just in case listeners are not familiar, the IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. It's an international organization that makes loans to countries when they're in crisis, and often earmarks those loans with specific reforms. So you take an IMF loan and you have to make some prudential reforms, things that this international body thinks are good ideas. There have been some controversies where maybe some of their reforms turned out not to be such great ideas, but that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about an international body with credit, able to make these crisis loans and try to help in these crisis situations. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that having a strong central bank, an independent central bank, is a necessary condition for the IMF to be helpful in a crisis. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, or at least for the IMF to be helpful in reducing this credit growth after a crisis.
Yes. Okay, yep. So yeah, it's specifically the learning phenomenon. Is there a measured change in this one area?
Yep, and perhaps the most interesting conditional effect that we found, or the effect of one variable only operating under a certain set of conditions, is actually between democracy and the central bank. So what we found here when we tried to account for this conditional effect is that this effect of democracy on reducing credit growth is much, much stronger in the presence of a weak central bank. And this effect of a central bank in reducing credit growth is much, much stronger in an autocracy or a country that's not a democracy. So for this central bank independence and democracy, there's an either or effect. So a country to have this discipline after a crisis needs either a democracy to exhibit or to display that populist pressure, or it needs a central bank to engage in the sorts of changes in monetary or regulatory policy that reduce the credit growth after that, increase this learning effect. So it's really an interesting setup in that it's sufficient for just one or the other. You don't necessarily need both. Both is a little bit better than one, and what we found than just one, but it's still one is sufficient to actually have a substantial effect.
All right, so we're just about out of time. Do you have any closing thoughts? Any sort of underlying message or takeaway that listeners should take from this discussion?
I think the biggest would be to never undervalue the role of politics and economics. To look at anything macro finance, anything international economics oriented, anything about just the economic system as a whole, and to treat politics as though it's not an integral part of the system, as though it's not part of this complex interacting set of factors, is to miss out on one of the most important things driving the behavior that you see. We oftentimes need to take into account that looking at economics without considering politics gives us answers to questions we're asking that are wrong.
All right. And on that note, where can listeners find you online?
So the primary place that I write is a website called Quora. So that's the main one. So it's Quora.com. Then I believe it's Jake-Meyer-4. And I'm also on LinkedIn, but Quora is the primary place that I write.
Right. And for listeners who haven't heard of Quora, Quora is a question and answer site. This is where I heard about Jake Meyer, and because he frequently answers questions about economics. And if you've been on the internet for a while and maybe are familiar with the low quality kind of things over at Yahoo Answers, this is like a highbrow version of that.
Yeah.
Very detailed quality answers on academic subjects like economics.
I like to think of it as Quora to Yahoo Answers is Facebook to MySpace. It's
right.
The
yes.
that came along and does it better, or did it the right way.
Yes. My guest today has been Jake Meyer. Jake, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Yeah, thank you.
If you want to discuss that episode of Economics Detective Radio, how about join the Facebook group? Go to Facebook and search Economics Detective and request to join the group. There you can have discussions about each episode and whatever you like. You can make a post about anything related to economics, request a topic or a guest for a future episode. Do whatever you want there, within reason, of course. So go to Facebook, search Economics Detective, request to join the group. And if you want to do a little more to help the show, how about you share it on social media? I depend on organic spread of the show to build my audience. I don't have a huge advertising budget, but as long as people like you are discussing the show or sharing it with their friends, sharing it on Twitter, on Facebook, on Reddit maybe, that's how I get more listeners, and that's how I have any listeners at all. So join the Facebook group, Economics Detective on Facebook, and share the show. Thanks, and I'll be back next week.